Chapter 3 of 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter. This Librivox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter by Elliott O'Donnell. Chapter 3 Some Strange Cases in Scotland. I returned to England in that tub-like old relic of mid-Victorian steamboats, the Argo, but which for many years sailed to and from Dublin and Bristol with as many passengers and cattle as could be crammed, with any degree of safety, into her dingy and clumsy-looking hulk. I remember the passage well, for two of my fellow students were on board, and we spent nearly all the time on deck, telling ghost tales, and earnestly discussing the possibility of a future life. In the end we made a solemn compact, whereby it was agreed that the one who died first would try his level best to give some kind of spirit demonstration to the other two. Both my friends died within a few years of that date, and within 3 weeks of each other. The one, who had a commission in a cavalry regiment, was killed at the Battle of Omdurman, and the other, who, having followed in the footsteps of his distinguished father, had become a novelist of great promise, was kicked to death by a horse. The day after the death of the former, as I was busily engaged writing the first chapter of my novel For Satan's Sake, a portion of the mantelpiece in the room in which I was working suddenly fell with a loud crash onto the grate. Of course, the incident may not have had anything to do with the death of my friend, but it was nevertheless remarkable, as previously nothing in the nature of a flaw had been noticeable in the condition of the mantelpiece. My other friend died, as I subsequently learned, i.e., after the incident I am about to narrate had occurred, at 10 o'clock one Friday morning, and that afternoon, as I was changing for football, the grandfather clock on the landing outside my bedroom suddenly struck 10. I went to look, and the hands pointed to 3. There had been nothing amiss with the striking before, and there was nothing amiss with the striking after. These were the only phenomena I experienced at the time these two friends of mine died. On arriving at Bristol, I spent some weeks in the west of England and then journeyed north to Scotland. My original intention had been to spend a few weeks with an old Clifton friend of mine, whose father owned an estate near Inveraray, but, on arriving at Glasgow, I heard of such a promising case of haunting in that city that, unable to resist the temptation of investigating it, I decided to postpone my journey west. The case, as outlined to me in the first instance, was this. A Glasgow solicitor named James Mackay, desirous of taking a house close to his office, went one morning to look at one in Duke Street. He went there alone, and carefully closing the front door behind him, proceeded to wander from room to room, beginning with the basement. As he was going upstairs to the first floor, he suddenly heard footsteps following him. He turned sharply round. There was no one there. Thinking this was odd, but attributing it to the acoustic properties of the walls, he continued his ascent. Having arrived on the first landing, he went into one of the rooms. The steps followed him. A brilliant idea then occurred to him. He stamped his foot. There was no echo. He turned round and went into the next room, and the steps once again accompanied him. Then he grew frightened. It was broad daylight. The sun was shining brilliantly, and the birds were singing. But there was something in this house that jarred on him horribly, a something that was completely out of humour with the golden sunbeams and the cheerful chirping of the sparrows. The day was hot, and the sun was pouring in through the blindless windows, but in spite of this the rooms were icy, and he was deliberating whether it was worth while to explore the house further, when he caught sight of a shadow on the wall. It was not his own shadow. It was that of a man with his arms stretched out horizontally on either side of him, and whereas the right arm was complete in every detail, the left had no hand. James Mackay now yielded to an ungovernable terror and rushed frantically out of the house. One would naturally think that after all this Mackay would have vowed never to go near the place again. Nothing of the sort. The house fascinated him. He could not get it out of his mind. He even dreamed of it in connection with some mystery that he must solve, that he alone could solve. Besides, there was not another house in the town so conveniently situated, nor so cheap. Consequently, he took it, and within a fortnight had moved in with all his family and household goods. For the first few weeks everything went swimmingly, and Mackay, who was shrewd even for a Scot, congratulated himself upon having made such an excellent bargain. Then occurred an incident which recalled sharply the day he had first seen the place. He was writing some letters one morning in his study, when the nursemaid entered, white and agitated. "Oh, do come to the nursery, sir," she implored. "The children are playing with something that looks like a dog and yet isn't one. I don't know what it is." And she burst out crying. "You're mad," Mackay said sharply, and springing to his feet he ran upstairs. On reaching the nursery, the blurred outline of something like a huge dog or wolf came out of the half-open door and raced past him, so close that he distinctly felt it brush against his clothes. Where it went he could not say. He was thinking of the children, and did not stop to look. Oddly enough, the children were not a bit afraid. On the contrary, they were pleased and curious. "What a strange doggie it was, Daddy!" they cried. "It never wagged its tail like other doggies, and whenever we tried to stroke it, it slipped away from us. We never touched it once." Sorely puzzled, Mackay told his wife, and the two decided that if anything further happened, they must leave the house. That night Mackay happened to sit up rather late. At last he got up and was about to turn off the gas, when he felt his upstretched hand suddenly caught hold of by something large and soft that did not seem to have any fingers. He was so frightened that he screamed, whereupon his hand was instantly released, and there was a loud crash overhead. Thinking something had happened to his wife, he rushed upstairs, and found her sitting up in bed and talking in her sleep. She was apparently addressing a black, shadowy figure that was crouching on the floor opposite her. As Mackay approached, the thing moved towards the wall and vanished. Mrs. Mackay then awoke, and begged her husband to take her out of the house at once, as she had dreamed most vividly that an appalling murder had been committed there, and that the murderer had come out of the room with outstretched hands, asking her to look at them. Mackay, who had had quite enough of it too, promised to do as she wished, and before another 24 hours had passed, the house was once again empty. These were the bare facts of the case, and as they were given me by one of his clients, I had no difficulty in obtaining an interview with Mr. Mackay, who, I was told, still had the keys of the house. It was not, however, so easy to obtain consent to spend a night on the premises, and he would only permit me to do so on the condition that he himself accompanied me, and that I promised to keep the visit a profound secret. The evening chosen for our enterprise proved ever memorable. The rain came down in torrents, and the wind, a veritable tornado, made any attempt to hold up an umbrella utterly impossible. Indeed, it was as much as I could do to hold up myself, whilst, to add to my discomfort, at almost every step I plunged ankle-deep in icy cold puddles. At length, drenched to the skin, I arrived at the house. Mackay was standing on the doorstep, swearing furiously. He could not, so he said, find the key. However, he produced it now, and we were soon standing inside, shaking the water from our clothes. Those were the days before pocket flashlights had become general, and we had to be content with candles. We each lighted one, and at once commenced to search the premises to make sure no one was in hiding. The house, as far as I can recollect, consisted of 4 stories and a basement. None of the rooms were very large. The wallpapers were hideous, and I remember thanking my stars that I was not called upon to live in such hopelessly inartistic quarters. Mackay asked me if I could detect anything peculiar in the atmosphere, but I could only detect extreme mustiness, and told him so. I fancied he seemed very fidgety and ill at ease. However, as he was a much older man than myself, and had some experience of the house, I felt perfectly safe with him. After we had been in all the rooms, we descended to the ground floor, and commenced our vigil on the staircase leading from the hall to the first landing. "I think we stand more chance of seeing something here than anywhere else," Mackay said, "and in the case of anything very alarming happening, we are close to the front door." He spoke only half in fun, and I observed that his fingers twitched a good deal and that his eyes were never at rest. "Oughtn't we to put out the candles?" I said. "Ghosts surely materialize much more readily in the dark." But he would not hear of it. All his experiences, he said, had taken place in the light, and he believed only spoof ghosts at séances required the opposite conditions. Then he regaled me once more with all that had happened during his occupation of the house. He was still telling me when there came a loud rat rat at the door. "That's a policeman," he said. "He must have seen our light." He spoke truly, for when we opened the door a burly figure in helmet and cape stood on the step, and flashed his dripping bull's-eye in our faces. On hearing Mackay's name the constable was instantly appeased, and when we mentioned ghosts, he laughed long and loud. "Well, gentlemen," he said, "you won't never be alarmed by a happarition so long as you have that dog with you. I bet he would scare away any number of ghosts, and burglars too. If I may be so bold as to ask, what breed do you call him? I've never seen anything quite like him before." And he waved his lamp toward the stairs. We both looked in the direction he indicated, and there, halfway up the stairs, with its face apparently turned towards us, was the black, shadowy outline of some shaggy creature, which to me looked not so much like a dog as a bear. It remained stationary for a moment or so, and then, retreating backwards, seemed to disappear into the wall. "Well, gentlemen, good night," the policeman said, lowering his lamp. "It's time I was going." He turned on his heel and was walking off when Mackay called him back. "Wait a moment, constable," he said, "and we'll come with you." He cast a swiftly furtive glance around him as he spoke, then, blowing out the lights, he caught me by the arm and dragged me away. "But the dog, sir," the policeman said, as the front door closed behind us with a bang. "It ain't come out." "And it never will," Mackay responded grimly. "You have seen the ghost, constable, or at least one of them." I have never had an opportunity of visiting that house again, but for aught I know to the contrary, it still stands there, and is still haunted. From Glasgow I went on to Inverary, where I had the most delightful time, fishing and shooting. I then went to Perth, and there, quite by chance, met a Mr. and Mrs. Rowlandson, who informed me that they were just quitting a badly haunted house on the outskirts of the town. The name of the house was Bocarthe. It was their own, and had only been built a year, but they could not possibly remain in it, they told me, owing to the perpetual disturbance to which they were subjected. They were just beginning a detailed description of the manifestations, when I begged them to desist. I would like, I explained, with their permission, to investigate the case, and I thought it would be better to do so without knowing the nature of the hauntings, as in these circumstances, should my experience happen to tally with theirs, there could be no question either of suggestion or of imagination. I had resolved to conduct all my investigations with an absolutely open mind, and I intended, when once I had satisfied myself that the phenomena were objective, to try and alight upon some code whereby I could communicate with them, and learn from them something certain, something definite at all events, about the other world. To what extent I have succeeded I shall make it the purpose of this volume to reveal. But to continue. What strikes us as so extraordinary about the whole thing, the Rowlandsons said, is that a new house, with absolutely no history attached to it, for we were the first people who ever inhabited it, and we can assure you, they added laughingly, there were no murders or suicides there during our occupancy, should be haunted. Our neighbours declare that we must have brought the ghost with us. I told them I thought it quite possible that such might be the case, and narrated to them my experiences in Dublin. They appeared to be greatly interested, and were, moreover, quite willing, provided I promised them not to discuss the matter too openly, as they wanted to let the house, that I should spend a few nights at Bocarthe. They were, in fact, rather anxious to know if anything unusual still took place there. Thinking, perhaps, that I might not like to go alone, they gave me an introduction to a young friend of theirs, Dr. Swinton, who, they thought, might be prevailed upon to accompany me, and before I left them, all the preliminaries relating to my visit to Bocarthe were satisfactorily arranged. That same day the Rowlandsons went to Edinburgh, where they told me they intended living, and the following day at noon I wended my way to the house they had vacated. As there was no story connected with Bocarthe, I set to work to make enquiries about the ground on which it stood, and instead of learning too little, I learned too much. An old minister, who looked full 80, was sure that the ground in question, until it was built upon quite recently, had been grazing land ever since he was a boy, and that it had never witnessed anything more extraordinary than the occasional death of a sheep or a cow that had been struck by lightning. An equally aged and equally positive postmistress declared that the ground had never been anything better than wasteland, where, amid rubbish heaps galore, all the dogs in the parish might have been seen scratching and fighting over bones. Another person remembered a pond being there, and another a nursery garden, but from no one could I extract the slightest hint as to anything that could in any way account for the haunting. When I entered the house, I thought I had seldom seen such a cheerful one. The rooms were light and lofty, and about them all there was an air of geniality that hitherto, at all events, I had never dreamed of associating with ghosts. Dr. Swinton joined me in the evening, but although we sat up till long after dawn, we neither saw nor heard anything we could not account for by natural causes. We repeated the process for 2 more nights, and then, feeling that we had given the house a fair trial, we concluded it was either no longer haunted or that the hauntings were periodical and might not occur again for years. I wrote to Mr. Rowlandson upon returning the keys of the house, and in reply received the following letter from him. Crescent, Edinburgh, November 8th, 1893. Dear Mr. O'Donnell, many thanks for the keys. No wonder you did not see our ghost. It is here, and we are having just the same experiences in this house as we had in Bocarthe. If you would care to stay a few nights with us, on the chance of seeing the ghost, we shall be delighted to put you up. Yours, etc., Robert Rowlandson. I was obliged to return home very shortly in order to decide definitely and speedily what I intended to do for a living. But although I knew I had little or no time to waste, I could not resist the Rowlandsons' kind invitation to try and see their ghost, and accordingly accepted. They lived in the Crescent. When I arrived there, I found the entire household in a panic, the ghost having appeared to one and all during the previous night. "It was so terrible," Mrs. Rowlandson said, "that I can't bear even to think of it,
and shall certainly never forget it. One of the maids fainted, and was so ill afterwards, we were obliged to have the doctor, and all have given notice to leave."
"Did nothing of the sort happen before you went to Bocarthe?" I ventured to ask. "No," Mr. Rowlandson replied, "not a thing. We were then sceptics where ghosts were concerned, but we're certainly not sceptical now." "Do you think it possible," I said, "that the ghost is attached to some piece of old furniture? I have read of such cases." Mr. Rowlandson shook his head. "No," he said, "we have no old furniture. All our furniture is modern and new. At least, it was new when we came to Bocarthe." "Then, if the ghost is neither attached to the house, nor to the ground, nor to the furniture, it must surely be attached to some person," I remarked. I have read that one of the dangers of attending spiritualistic séances is that spirits occasionally attach themselves to people, and can only be got rid of with great difficulty. I suppose no one in the house has gone in for spiritualism? "I can safely say I haven't," Mr. Rowlandson laughed. "And you haven't either, Maud, have you?" he said, looking at his wife. Mrs. Rowlandson flushed.
The only spiritualist I ever knew," she stammered, "was—you know, dear, whom I mean."
Mr. Rowlandson raised his eyebrows and stared at her in astonishment. "I don't," he said. "Who?"
"Ernest Dekon."
"Dekon!" Mr. Rowlandson ejaculated. "Dekon! Why, of course, I might have guessed spiritualism was in his line. Some years ago, Mr. O'Donnell," he went on, turning to me, "my wife met this Mr. Dekon at a ball given by a mutual friend, and from that time, up to his death, he persecuted her with his undesirable attentions. I never knew anyone so persistent." "He resented your marriage, of course," I remarked. "Resented it?" Mr. Rowlandson responded. "I should rather think he did, though to everyone's surprise he came to it. Ye gods! I shall never forget the expression on his face as we caught sight of him in the vestibule of the church. Talk about Satan! Satan never looked half as evil." "And Mr. Dekon was a spiritualist," I said.
"He was very keen on séances," Mrs. Rowlandson interposed, "most keen, and was at one time always trying to persuade me to go to one with him."
"I never knew that," Mr. Rowlandson exclaimed.
"Perhaps not," his wife said demurely. "You see, you don't know everything. However, I never went."
"And how did he die?" I ventured. "Suicide," Mr. Rowlandson said. "He shot himself, and was dastardly enough to leave a note behind him, pinned to the toilet cover of his dressing table, stating that his death was entirely due to the heartless conduct of my wife." "When was that, Mr. Rowlandson?" I asked. "Let me see," Mr. Rowlandson soliloquized. "We have been married not quite 18 months. About 15 months ago, shortly before we came to Bocarthe."
"I know what's in your mind," Mrs. Rowlandson observed. "You think that very possibly it is the spirit of Ernest Dekon that is troubling us. Do you really think it could be?"
"From what you have told me," I said, "I should say that it is more than likely. The mere fact of his having been a spiritualist would mean that he had, in some measure, got in touch with the unknown, so that on passing over with his mind solely concentrated on revenge, he would in all probability speedily become closer acquainted with those spirits whom he had known here. Not a very high class, but apparently the only class that a séance can attract. And these would undoubtedly aid him in his attempt to come back and annoy you." Mrs. Rowlandson gave vent to an exclamation of dismay.
"I have always felt," she said, "that there might be some mysterious connection between Ernest Dekon and the dreadful thing we have seen."
"Of course," I added, That is only a suggestion on my part. When does the phenomenon usually appear?"
"At all times, and when we least expect it," Mrs. Rowlandson said. "For example, if I am going upstairs alone, it either springs out at me or peers down at me from over the banisters. Or again, it rouses us in the middle of the night by rocking our bed. Always some alarming trick of that kind."
"Then you could hardly expect it to manifest itself if we all sat here in the dark?"
"Hardly."
"You haven't a photograph of Mr. Deckan, I suppose?" I hazarded. "A photograph of that scoundrel?" Mr. Rowlandson cried. "If he had given her one, it wouldn't have remained long in her possession, I can assure you."
"Well, he never did," Mrs. Rowlandson said, forcing a smile. "But I can describe him."
"I don't know whether that will do much good," I observed, "because I understand that if one of the lower order of earthbounds, usually called elementals, wanted to fool us, it could easily impersonate him. Deccan's phantom would not, of necessity, be very like his material body. It would depend entirely on how much of the animal there was in him. If a great deal, then one might expect to see a creature with a pig's or some other kind of beast's head, with only a slight facial resemblance to Deccan. Can you describe his hands? Because I believe spirits that have lost all other resemblance with the physical body might be identified by some peculiarity in the formation of the fingers."
"Yes," Mrs. Rowlandson said. "I do remember his hands distinctly. They were so ugly. They were long and red, and the tips were club-shaped. I am sure I should recognize them anywhere."
This conversation took place in the interval between tea and dinner. After dinner we sat in the drawing-room, discussing plans for the night, and finally came to the conclusion that when bedtime came, we should retire to our respective rooms and sit there in the dark, waiting and watching for whatever might happen. It was furthermore agreed that directly anyone saw or heard anything, they should at once summon the others. We sat up rather late, and it was close on midnight before Mrs. Rowlandson rose, and we all, there were 2 guests besides myself, a colonel and Mrs. Rushworth, took our candlesticks and followed her upstairs. We had mounted the first flight and had turned the bend leading to the second, the house seemed all stairs, when Mrs. Rowlandson halted, and looking back at us, said, "Hush! Do you hear anything?" We stood still and listened. There was a thump, that apparently came from a room just at the top of the stairs. Then another, and then a very curious sound, as if something was bounding backwards and forwards over bare boards with its feet tied together. At a signal from Mr. Rowlandson, we immediately blew out our lights. A church clock solemnly struck 12. We heard it very distinctly, as the Rowlandsons, being enthusiasts for fresh air, kept every window in the house wide open. The reverberation of the final stroke had hardly ceased when a loud gasp from someone in front of me sent a chilly feeling down my spine. At the same moment the darkness ahead of us was dissipated by a faint, luminous glow. As I watched, the glow speedily intensified, and suddenly took the shape of a cylindrical column of 6 or 7 feet in height, and this in turn developed with startling abruptness into the form of something so shockingly grotesque and bestial that I was rendered speechless. It is extremely difficult to give a very accurate description of it, because, like the generality of occult phenomena I have experienced in haunted houses, it was a baffling mixture of the distinct and yet vague, entirely without substance, and apparently wholly constituted of vibrating light that varied each second in tone and intensity. I can only say that the impression I derived was that of a very gross or monstrous man. The head, ill-defined on the crown and sides, appeared to be abnormally high and long, and to be covered with a tangled mass of coarse, tow-coloured hair. The nose seemed hooked, the mouth cruel,
the eyes leering. The general expression on the face was one of intense antagonism. The body of the thing was grey and nude, very like the trunk of a silver beech. The arms long and knotted, the hands huge, the fingers red and club-shaped. The latter corresponded exactly with Mrs. Rowlandson's description. This hideous, baleful apparition was the spirit of animal man, the symbolical representation of all carnal lusts. It was Ernest Decon, soulless. But although this spirit was without substance, it was composed of complex forces both physical and mental. It could shut and open doors, move furniture, rap and make sundry other noises, and it could also convey the sensation of intense cold and the feeling of the most abject fear. I now found myself wondering if it possessed other properties. Was it sensible? Could it communicate in any way? I was thus deliberating when the figure seemed to move forward. Then someone shrieked. Mr. Rowlandson struck a light, and simultaneously the apparition vanished. The effect it had had on all of us was novel and striking. We were all more or less demoralized, and yet no two of us had seen the ghost the same, and some, Mr. Rowlandson and Mrs. Rushworth, had not seen it at all. We went back again into the drawing-room and discussed it. Mrs. Rowlandson was the first to speak. She, too, had been particularly impressed by the hands, and she was sure they were the hands of Ernest Decon. "I can say nothing about the face," she cried, "as it did not appear to me, but having seen the hands, I am firmly convinced that the ghost is Ernest Decon, and that it is Ernest Decon who is tormenting us. Can't any of you think of a plan to get rid of him?"
"Cremation is the only thing I can think of," cried Colonel Rushworth, who had hitherto been silent. "That is the means employed, I believe, by the hill tribes in northern India. When a spirit, the spirit they can identify, begins to haunt a place, they dig up the body and burn it. And they say that as soon as the last bone is consumed, the haunting ceases. They have a theory that phantoms of dead people and animals can materialize as long as some remnant of their physical body remains. Where did this Ernest Decon die?" "In Africa," Mr. Rowlandson said. "That's capital. If we can find a cemetery, there ought to be no difficulty in getting at the body. The officials are, as a rule, open to bribery. Anyhow, we might try it as an experiment." I left Edinburgh next day, but I heard some months later from Mr. Rowlandson. "You may recollect Colonel Rushworth's suggestion," he wrote. "Well, the hauntings have ceased. We are shortly returning to Bocarthe." From this I gathered that an attempt to exhume and cremate Ernest Decon's body had been made, and had proved successful. End of chapter 3.